as always. Okay, so welcome once again to another one of the 50th Mailbag Calls. For anybody who's joining us for the first time, I'll just run through. Very welcome to ask questions, type comments in the chat, raise a hand if you'd like to speak, and I'll cut to it at moments during the interview. But a big thank you to Dr. Campbell Plowden. I said I would only refer to him as Dr. once. It's Campbell from now on. Thank you for joining us, mate. Going to introduce you. These are always long, but so you started in Greenpeace 1979 in the US as a fundraiser. You're a media coordinator in 1977.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon. You were a media coordinator, crew member for the organization. You worked on the whaling project in Japan. You were on the James Bay when it confronted the Soviet fleet. You conducted undercover investigations of pirate whaling, wildlife smuggling, illegal logging. You were the head of the Greenpeace Whale Campaign in 1988. Since then, you've been working a number of other organizations like the Humane Society, Amazon Watch, Environmental Investigation Agency, and you set up and founded the Center for Amazon Community Ecology, and have spent some time living with the indigenous communities there as well. Thank you so much for putting your hand up and volunteering for this call. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
I just want to start, as I do with all these calls, right at the beginning. Do you remember the first time you heard about Greenpeace? What was going on, and what was it about it that made you want to sign up and join?
Well, a very key event for me in my life was I was invited to see some orcas that had been captured by SeaWorld, but there was a public outcry against it. And they were being, two of them were being held in a cove up in the San Juan Islands before being released with radio trackers. And I went up there and I spent 2 days with them. And I was just awestruck being in the presence of these animals. And I got connected to a little organization that was putting out a marine mammal newsletter called Leviathan. And one day, we'd sort of heard this thing about this group that was going out and doing these crazy things with the whales. But then someone said, hey, there's a guy from Vancouver. I was in Seattle at the time. There's a guy from Vancouver, Greenpeace, is coming to give a talk at REI. And let's go check it out. So we went there, and it was Michael Bailey from Greenpeace Canada back then. And afterwards, a small group of us went out to a bar, as often happens. And two guys, Bruce Haft and I, said, well, we'll take care of the whale campaign. Two other people said, well, we'll do the seals. And somebody else said, well, we're going to keep super tankers out of Puget Sound. So that was a pretty ambitious agenda for 5 people sitting around in a bar. But that was the core of Greenpeace Seattle. And it was not long after that, I just started selling some whale buttons. And by chance, my dad was doing a business trip to Hawaii. So I went there, and they were in the middle of putting together the Ohana Kai to go out and find whoever. And I gave a little report about this nascent group in Seattle. And afterwards, two women who had been fundraising, they'd just done a walkathon, called me and said, can we come talk to you? And they basically said, would you guys like to organize a walkathon in Seattle to raise money for our ship? And so we talked about it. We borrowed some money from Greenpeace San Francisco, and 6 weeks later, we had a walkathon. And a little bit after that, I got to go on the James Bay as a crew member, photographer, medic, and Rex Swiler was sort of my mentor, of course. And afterwards, the other connection that was really important was Mel Gregory was on board as the ship's minstrel.
Right.
And he sang a couple of whale songs, which of course the whalers couldn't hear over the wind and whatever. But I went from there because I wanted to keep doing something. So I kind of went on tour and asked people to play the guitar, because I didn't play any guitar then. But that sort of got me thinking about, okay, what can I do that can make a difference in this issue? Because, you know, just going out on the crew is really not doing that much. And it was clear that Japan was the focal point of the whaling industry. So I started studying Japanese on my own at Seattle Central Community College. And then it so happened that my parents had moved to Brazil for a little while. So I went to Brazil, and through a connection, I got on board a Brazilian whaling boat and got to take pictures of whales being killed from the bridge of the whaling ship, which was pretty tough. We knew that there was some whaling going on in Chile. So I'd rassled up another couple $100 from Greenpeace Seattle, and I went to Chile. And, you know, I didn't know what I was doing, but I managed to sort of end up staying in a bed and breakfast that was run by people who worked in the whaling ship. And so I had New Year's Day camping out, you know, with the whalers. And I was trying to get on board that ship. But the director of the company came back from vacation. He was understandably suspicious of me. And he took me down to the government office, and they said, well, you can't go on board. Fine, you know. And that night I was visited in my hotel room by 3 people from the Chilean police who talked to me for 2 hours. They destroyed film in my camera. They listened to recordings I had. Unfortunately, they didn't find a 33-page report that I had hidden under the flap in my clothes bag. So anyway, that I've just sort of been rattling on, but I'll pause there.
That is an astounding story. As somebody who spent, I mean, most of their life campaigning around nature, preservation of, you know, with a large part of it around whales. What was it like being on a whaling ship with whalers and spending Christmas and time with them? Like that's real. I'm sorry, I'm very interested. If other people have questions that they would prefer were asked, please type them in the chat. But that's fascinating. It makes me think a lot about something Bill spoke about during his talk. You know, talking and actually seeing the perspective of other people. What was it like?
At first, it was exciting because the ironic thing was that when I was on the James Bay, we found the factory ship, but they were not doing any active whaling when we were with them. So I didn't actually see whaling going on. But then when I was on the ship, the whaling ship itself, I mean, to be honest, it's thought, okay, these are going to be really powerful photos. And for the first 4 whales, I was just totally focused on taking pictures. And after that, just my soul was just getting torn apart. And I just sat down after, you know, the 5th whale because I could hear it crying as it was, you know, hit by the harpoon. And I had to pretend that this was all perfectly normal, and it was exciting to see this going on. And the guy who was sort of my guide just sort of said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm feeling a little seasick. I'll be fine." And I guess ironically, the next day I went to the shore station where I saw the whales being cut up. And, there was all the blood and whatnot, but honestly, it wasn't nearly as emotional watching the dead whales being butchered as it was seeing those 5 whales killed, 50 feet away from me.
It's heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. Sorry, you derailed me for a moment there. That is, I imagine it would be heartbreaking.
But, but those feelings are what stayed with me and gave me a motivation to stick with the whaling campaign for the next 13 years.
Yeah. You mentioned when you were thinking about it, that you saw Japan as being sort of a nexus and started to just learn Japanese by yourself. And you did go to Japan? And
Yeah, so the evolution of that was that it was in, I believe, late, I'm getting my dates mixed up now, but late 78, 79, we were having a Greenpeace USA meeting in San Francisco. And the idea came up as like, we need to go over to Japan and do an action with the shore-based whaling station. And Paul Spong had been to Japan, Dexter Cade had been to Japan on the dolphin issue, and really not much movement. But when we kind of looked around the room and said, okay, well, how do we go about this? We don't really know anything about the details of Japanese whaling other than, they're out there in the water.
Mm.
And so, sort of being the sciencey investigative type I was, and I was the only one who spoke Japanese, they said, well, why don't you go? So I went over with initially with a Japanese woman who was associated with Greenpeace in Vancouver as my interpreter. And we spent the first several months visiting every shore-based whaling station in Japan to, suss out the logistics, look at the whale meat markets, just try to understand the industry from inside out. Yeah. And came to the conclusion that we weren't ready to do an action that could have any impact there. That, it could be the usual thing of get some media that might have some play in the foreign press, but it wouldn't do anything to really advance the cause within Japan. And so, we sort of carried on, and that morphed into then finding out about more pirate whaling going on. So I'd gone to all the fish markets in Japan. I knew about the whale meat statistics inside and out. Every month I went to the government agencies to get the statistics on imports. And so I made it to Taiwan with my partner, Rebecca Clark, and we stayed there for 2 months and documented 4 different whaling ships that came in. We tracked the whale meat. We found that they were smuggling the whale meat into Japan via Korea. And then another team took over for us. And then Paul Watson rammed the Sierra. And all of a sudden it felt a little dicey to be there, because we found out from a contact in the Japanese media that the Japanese fisheries agency were basically watching us the whole time we were in Taiwan. They didn't make contact. They didn't try to stop us, but they wanted to see what we were up to. And we almost got caught by the Korean authorities, but we made it out of there. So that was year 1, and then came home, wrote that all up, and thought, there's a lot of unfinished business here. And Greenpeace said, well, all right, we'll let you go back to Japan, but this time you have to do the action. So I was like, all right, we'll do the action.
Righto, yeah.
So we brought a crew over, and we set it all up. So we were monitoring this whaling station, and the idea was that we would have one woman get on board the whaling ship, chain herself to the harpoon cannon. She would have leaflets available to explain what she was doing. And so they were, I wasn't part of that crew because I was part of an outreach team that we wanted to stay in Japan and do outreach afterwards. So we didn't want to risk being arrested or deported. So the action crew did their job. They got Patty Hutchison on board, and then they did the one thing that we didn't expect. They took off with her, and and the Zodiacs were like, "Holy crap, what do we do?" And they just took off with her. But we did manage to get some pictures, and it turned out that they brought her to a port and basically said, "Get lost." They didn't want to have another big hurrah like they did with Dexter Caton freeing the dolphins. So, I took the film down to, I forget, to AP or Time Magazine, developed the film back in those days when we had to wait hours to develop the film. And there was the shot of Patty on the harpoon cannon. And they said, we can't use this. I said, why? I said, well, there's no tension in it. And so we had done everything possible to try to minimize a violent reaction between our person and the whalers. And we succeeded too well. We had a woman, we had one person, we had an explanation of why we were there. And as soon as she was there on the harpoon cannon, they asked her, said, it's getting cold, do you want to come inside? And she said, no, I'm good. So they just left her alone until they brought her to the port and let the authorities deal with her.
So no conflict, no media.
No conflict, no story.
Yeah.
And afterwards, we got interviewed by this Japanese magazine, which we found out was a total setup.
Really?
They paid for our meal, and of course, the photographer got a shot of Patty eating something with meat in it. And that was the big story about the Greenpeace hypocrites. That, we eat whale meat, you eat beef, what's the difference? And, as tired as that argument sounds, it's one that's used over and over and over again.
It's something. I'm interested in what you said before, because I know one of the things that you did while you were there was you were part of the outreach to other ecology groups as well, and helping to really connect Greenpeace or start the conversations and the things that would connect Greenpeace. What were the I'm curious how that was. What was Greenpeace's presence like? How was it perceived? Because the whaling campaign's one of our most well-known campaigns, but it's understood very differently in Japan than most of the rest of the world.
Well, it was, being a foreigner in Japan talking about the whaling issue was not easy, obviously. So we connected with Japanese anti-nuclear groups, both peace groups, anti-nuclear power groups, groups interested in pollution. And we didn't try to do anything, but we were a presence supporting them at public events. And we made an attempt to start Greenpeace Japan. We didn't get very far because the legal knots and frankly, we didn't have the backing of international at that point. It was just a very nascent effort that, fortunately has obviously taken root as a valid part of the Greenpeace family now.
What were the things you were really conscious of thinking of when you were doing that as an outsider coming into, a different culture, a different context, and what are the things that you learned during that?
While I think, clearly my motivation, many people's motivation for the whale campaign is a very personal one. It's an ethical issue. That's just not, if you want to try to gain ground in Japan, or anywhere where there's a cultural association with it, you can't put that argument up front. So what we did was we focused on the facts. The pirate whaling was a big wedge because Japan prides itself on being honorable. And the fact that there were people who were doing whaling that if it wasn't, quote, illegal, it was at least outside the bounds of IWC. There were people who were importing whale meat illegally from other countries. So really hitting on those arguments, we gained a little bit of ground.
You worked on an investigation documenting those breaches as well by the pirate vessels as well.
The pirate whaling, and the other one that came up a little bit later was the small scale coastal whaling, which is now what Japan is continuing outside of the IWC. And what we did with that when that came up, when Japan was trying to win an exemption through the IWC to have their small-scale coastal whaling classified under the same category as Aboriginal whaling was we basically documented that several of those, quote, small whaling ships were associated with the larger whaling companies, that the history of whaling in those places was very short in most cases. We went to other parts of Japan, in southern Japan, where whaling had been done in the traditional way, where you would have monks recording a Buddhist name for every whale that was killed in a special log with stone monuments to commemorate the soul of the whale that was killed to feed that village. Those places are not whaling anymore. So we wanted to show that there is a historical disconnect between what is put forward as, quote, traditional whaling, when it really was a very discrete part of Japanese history, different from when modern whaling began for very different reasons.
I'm going to pause for a moment to give people the opportunity to ask any questions if they would like to. Please raise a hand in the chat or type a question in the chat. Hope you'll forgive me, but I have to ask about 1988 and the whales trapped off Barrow. I have to. They made a movie about it, and it's one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. So I'll give people a moment to ask questions, firstly, if there are any, and then I'll move on to that. Okay. So people haven't seen the movie or haven't heard the story. It was 1988. You were the head of the US whaling campaign, I understand. I'm right? Yeah, there we go. Yes, what a story. What a story. So there were three, I understand three whales which were trapped when the ice refroze, and Greenpeace was part of, although I would say part of the campaign or part of something. You describe it as it was an organised effort between the Indigenous peoples, the different governments with, how did you phrase it? The media and Greenpeace greasing the wheels. But this is, can you tell people a little bit about this?
Sure.
And how it all happened?
Sure. Well, I mean, just to put it in context, this was happening at the time when we were focused with the campaign on a boycott of Icelandic fish products to try to pressure Iceland to give up its bogus research whaling program. And it was a very grassroots, canvas-based program, and we were grinding it out and having some success in very incremental ways, but really very little press. And I walked into the office one day, I was at home, and I heard some story on the radio about, oh, there's some whales trapped up in the ice in Alaska. And, this happens. But it so happened that there was a local reporter who got wind of it and put it out. And for whatever reason, it just caught fire. And I walked into the office, and there were like 5 messages from people saying, what's Greenpeace going to do to free the whales up in Alaska? Holy shit, I don't know. What do you do about whales trapped up in Alaska? So I contacted our Greenpeace person in Anchorage, Cindy, and said, I don't know what's going on, but you should get up there. And so she went up there. So we had some eyes up on the ice. And at first it was like, well, icebreakers. So I became an expert in the next 3 days on all manner of breaking ice. And it turned out that the US had no icebreakers anywhere near there. And then it just got crazy. It's like the Eskimos were whacking away with chainsaws. You had these guys coming in from Minnesota with things meant to do jacuzzis. We had an oil company with this big barge that never got there. We had President Reagan making a public call to the Marine colonel in charge of the operation on the site, saying, whatever you need, we'll get you. So meanwhile, there was just this incremental movement, and one of the whales was, I think, just got tired and drowned. But somewhere in there, we realized it's like, okay, who else has icebreakers? Well, the Soviet Union, duh. And so I got hold of McTaggart and said, do you know anyone in the Soviet Union who could help us? And he said, yeah, we know this guy, Admiral Chilingarov. Here's his telex number. I don't know if any of you remember what telexes are and knew what a telex is, but it preceded all the technology that you're familiar with. So we sent a telex to this admiral and explained briefly what was going on. And he said, yeah, well, we'll think about it. Because they were not unaware of the media that was happening, and that this would be a pretty neat thing to do to have them look good. But we are doing this cat and mouse where they finally said, well, we're willing to come, but the US government has to give us permission. And so the media were saying, are you getting the Russians there? And I said, what's, I can't be too upfront about that. And I ended up basically having close to a shouting match with a guy from Department of State, who they were wanting to save face. They didn't want the Soviets to come in with their icebreakers and free our whales.
This is in the middle of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But finally, we basically called their bluff, and I went to the media and said, yeah, the Soviets are willing to come, but the US has to let them in. And finally they gave them permission. The Soviets sent in the icebreakers. They broke through, 2 whales swum to freedom, and hopefully they weren't killed by the same Russian whalers the next year. So in the middle of that, it was this media storm about these couple of gray whales. Meanwhile, Iceland was still chugging away, killing hundreds of whales. But it was it was an important lesson that you don't always get press for what you want to get press for at the time you want to get it. Opportunities come along, and you got to jump on them.
I read an account that you wrote about it, which I'll link in the chat. It's in the Wayback Machine, but it's still accessible. And you do talk a lot about trying to make those connections, like while the press is there, helping people to understand that it's not just about 3 whales. It is, as you said, these same whales could be harpooned by a Soviet whaling vessel the next week. So yeah, very interesting. And I think a good lesson for everybody else as well. Is there anybody that has a question, a comment, or who would like to raise their hand? I see one from Charlie Cray, who remembers the Icelandic boycott and picketing Burger King in 1988. It's incredible. Is there anybody else that has any questions or comments? No, nobody wants to. These stories are so powerful. Yeah, I agree. I think the one about whale screaming is going to stay with me. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now, the sort of things that you're doing, and particularly about, again, it seems a theme here that is emerging is that when you begin campaigning on something, when you begin working on something, you go directly to the source. Rode on the whaling vessels, went to Japan, and now that you're doing work around the Amazon, you went to live for some time in those communities or to stay with those communities. Would love to know a little bit about that, and also about why you take that approach. What value that's, and why obviously you think it's incredibly important. I would love to hear more about that.
Sure, thank you. Well, I guess just to provide a quick bridge, I worked on the whaling issue pretty much exclusively for many years, and we dealt with the moratorium, et cetera, and then it was actually at an IWC meeting, and I met a fellow named Charles Secret from Friends of the Earth UK, who was talking about, the whales are important, but there's this issue that's really important too, that's the tropical rainforest. And he started rapping about it, and I was just enthralled. And I thought, this is the ultimate endangered species issue, that, we're rightly concerned about individual animals who are being overhunted. But when we talk about tropical deforestation, we're talking about millions of species being lost, the whole fabric of the planet being torn apart. And I had spent some time in Brazil as a child. I, went back to do the whaling thing. And so for whatever reason, the Amazon really spoke to me. And so I actually started my first organization called Terra International, the Tropical Ecosystem Research and Rescue Alliance, in the mid 80s, and went down and spent 3 months traveling through Brazil first to meet environmental groups, visited logging operations, visited ranching operations, visited a dam, just to get a whole overview of the big picture about tropical deforestation in Brazil, and then basically paid for my trip documenting illegal bird captures in a couple of countries while I was at it. And when I came back, that organization sort of, it was just me, and we didn't really have many resources. And then I went from the Humane Society of the US back to Greenpeace in 88, around then. And then Greenpeace said, we'd like to do a tropical rainforest campaign. Would you like to start it? And I said, sure. So it's like, okay, I've got my group where I could do whatever I want with no budget, or Greenpeace, here's a $300,000 budget. You can hire your ideal team to do whatever you want. So it's like, okay, goodbye, Tara. I'll give Greenpeace a shot. But it was an awkward time in a way, because it was at the same time when a number of campaigns were starting to do things in South America. So you had the turtle campaign doing one thing, you had various campaigns all acting sort of independently in different South American countries. And so Greenpeace sort of International did a pause and said, okay, before we have more campaigns doing whatever, we need to bring some coherency to this. So they hired Tanya Adams to be sort of Greenpeace Latin America coordinator. And she basically put things on hold for outside campaigners. And so it was an awkward time for me where I wanted to, get going on doing something with the rainforest campaign in Brazil, but I couldn't work in South America. So I basically started doing other things, and we joined forces with some of the other groups that were doing the campaigns to try to get the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, to shift their loan policies away from doing things that were bad. We connected with groups in Indonesia. So we did a training program where we brought together NGOs from 5 different NGOs throughout Indonesia and trained them how to document illegal logging in their country. And I hired someone to try to infiltrate the tropical timber industry. So, doing these various things, here and there. And, honestly, I think we did some good, but not a lot. And I mean, I thought that I knew what I was doing with the whale campaign. With the rainforest campaign, it just began to feel very odd, where I was being, someone showing up at the World Bank in some way trying to represent the interests of forest peoples. And I had no standing to do that. It was at one meeting of the International Tropical Timber Organization held in Ecuador, where I finally had a chance to go visit a native village that was the focal point of resistance to oil exploration in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And those 3 days I spent there were fundamental to me. I'd had a chat with Steve Sawyer before the meeting and before going, and he said, why are you going to this ITTO meeting? Does this really fit anywhere? Is there a strategy? And I just felt like, I gotta go. And after that, basically I was demoted. He put Patrick Anderson, who'd been the European coordinator in charge, and I sort of worked on special projects for another year. But during that time, I thought, okay, if I want to be serious about the rainforest issue in the way that I had been about the whaling issue, I need to get a deeper grounding. And so I went to Brazil and visited several different native groups to see if they would be interested in having somebody work with them on this theme of non-timber forest products. Because during the campaign, the general rap was like, well, logging's bad, ranching's bad, plantations are bad, oil's bad, dams are bad. How are people who live in the forest supposed to make a living? And the one thing that kept being put forward was, well, there's this richness in the rainforest of non-timber forest products. And a couple of studies had shown that they could be valuable. There was this movement of the rubber tappers in Acre in Brazil, and of course the assassination of the union leader Chico Mendes, that brought a lot of attention to the fact that, like, hey, we can move away from the old style of major landowners and support people's movements where they can be controlling their own land, they can be selling value-added products to try to get more value from the forest without cutting it down. But the one statistic that really stuck in my mind was that in Brazil, 20% of the Amazon was already declared as indigenous areas. But somehow the assumption was being made is like, well, indigenous people take care of the land, they're doing fine, we don't need to worry about them. Well, that doesn't match with reality. Most indigenous people do not want to continue living exactly in the traditional way. They want to develop in their own way. They want money. So it's not a question of keeping people of, it began to feel awkward where it's like, as a conservationist, we can't be telling indigenous people, you have to keep living the way that you lived 100 years ago. We need to work with them so that they can develop in their way that still respects nature, but in a way that also reflects their genuine desire to interact and get some of the benefits of the modern world.
Self-determination, of course. Yeah.
So I ended up, I left Greenpeace in '93. I went back to school and I spent 7 years at Penn State getting a PhD in ecology, studying the ecology, management, and marketing of non-timber forest products. And that involved living with the Tembe Indians in the Brazilian Amazon for 2 years, doing case studies on different NTFPs. And a lot of things came from that. One was that it's not realistic to think that people can make a decent living harvesting NTFPs and selling them as raw products. They're just, at the beginning of the supply chain, they're just gonna stay poor. The other things that I learned personally was that I wanted to be a part of the community. When I went in there, I was alone a lot of the time, or I was with my family. So I started buying handicrafts. I was a medic. I was bringing in monies to support land rights work. And you know what? It felt good to be helpful for a while. I realized that I had lost some humility. it felt good to be an important person in this village, but ultimately it was not right.
Mm.
And so when I left Brazil, I was traumatized. I was actually asked to leave the community because at the end, what I'd been saying is, we have $10,000 available for you to support land rights work, but you have to say who's going to coordinate it, who's going to be responsible for the money, what's your plan? And basically my village said, give us the money now or you're out of here. And so it ended in a very painful way for me. I thought, well, I'm way over my head working with communities. And I went back for a time to just focusing on researching ecology stuff. I made my way to Peru, and I was focusing on this really cool tree resin that is produced in relation to bark-boring weevils, and bees harvest it to pollinate things, etc. But after doing that for 2 years, I realized, there's no point in just continuing in this pure ecological research piece at a research station. If this can't be applied in the real world, then there's no point in this. I don't want to be an academic. And so a key moment for me was in the early 90s, I started attending a Quaker meeting. I'd been to a Quaker meeting back in Seattle in the early Greenpeace days because I was sort of interested in the Quaker connection to the early Greenpeace movement. And then when I had a child, my wife and I wanted to raise our child in some faith tradition, and the Quakers fit. So
I don't know about that.
After my experience with the community in Brazil, it took a while to get to a point. It's like, all right, I met with a Quaker healer, and he said, you can't not work with communities. That's what you have to do. And so I put my toe in the water again. Some friends who'd been working in Peru longer than me introduced me to a couple communities. And I went to them and I said, look, here's me. I have this very small group. I'm not going to make any big promises, but I'd be interested in helping you develop some value-added non-timber forest products. And so what I learned was, you can't promise what you can't deliver. And so I just started to build those relationships, one person at a time, one artisan at a time, and just slowly started to get enough grant money to pay some people to do some field work, and then eventually started buying more handicrafts and selling them back in the States, and realized, okay, this can work. So, the fast forward, that was in 2006, and we now work with 16 communities in the northern Peruvian Amazon. We now do 4 different types of workshops where we hire artisans who know how to make new things to teach other artisans how to do that. We support reforestation projects with the trees that are used for making the woven products. We are supporting the artisans coming together to form strong artisan organizations and showing them how to market their own products. And the key element that's come in the last couple of years is, through my Quaker meeting, I started working with a project called the Alternatives to Violence Project. And that was, again, started by the Quakers in the late 70s to do conflict resolution training, initially with inmates in a prison in New York State. That group has now grown to doing those kinds of trainings in 40 states in the US and over 50 countries.
Wow.
And one of the main issues that we were facing working with our partner communities in Peru was that we were seeing progress of people learning to make the crafts better, but it was much harder dealing with the social aspects, where they were used to making things on their own, selling things on their own, and they viewed their neighbors as their competitors. And so they were very reluctant to share how they would make things with anyone who wasn't one of their relatives. And the logic of saying, look, if you work together, you can sell more. They'd hear that, but it didn't really take. And once I thought, all right, I'm just going to give it a shot to bring AVP here and see what happens. And it's made a profound difference. So now the people who are our trainers in the workshops have all gone through AVP training. So when they sit down with other artisans, they're not just showing them the techniques of how to weave something. They're very attentive to explaining something, showing them, giving them positive feedback, and affirming them. So building people's confidence and generating that spirit of a desire to work together is what's really making a key difference now. It's not just the manual stuff, it's the heart stuff of having people appreciate what it means to actually work together and enjoy that process.
It's very interesting. I see a comment in the chat that somebody's partner, Doug, your partner's been doing the training in Arlington. Strikes me as something that a lot of people, it would be better if a lot of people in the world did stuff around exactly what you're talking about, listening, conflict resolution, understanding. It seems there's less and less of that in the world today. I'm going to again pause for questions before forging ahead, because I don't want to monopolize the time as I usually do. But does anybody have a question? Anybody want to raise a hand? Chris, I've got Chris.
First of all, Campbell, thanks so much for being so generous with all of these stories, and of course for all of this work that you've done that we are all benefiting from it. Question I had, sort of a two-part question. So you said something earlier when talking about the whaling campaigns that work was really personal for everyone who was a participant at the time. And I guess I'm curious, especially hearing about this deep level of commitment and education and continued education and immersion in different topics that you've had over the years, is both what for you was the source of that personal passion, or what drew you to this work and gave you that personal commitment to it. And I guess over the second part would be what sort of sustains that or refills that for you over time as you've continued to really apply yourself wholly to all of this. So yeah, thanks again.
Wow. Well, thank you. I think you don't get involved with a group like Greenpeace unless you have some gut level connection with nature. And for me, that came from, I grew up in Connecticut, and then most importantly, I went to summer camp in the Adirondacks. So I grew up hiking, canoeing. My grandfather taught me to fish. I was very close. I was an only child, but I was very close to my pets. So that was sort of the seeds of a sense of connection to nature and animals. Then the next key step was when I was a junior in high school, was the very first Earth Day in 1970. And my high school, which was a prep school in Connecticut, did a very unusual thing. They canceled all regular classes for the entire week and brought in speakers and movies focusing on a whole diverse aspect of the environmental crisis. And I mean, that changed my life. Up until that point, I had visions of, I want to be a doctor and I want to find a cure for cancer. And at the end of that week, I thought, no, this is it. This is my calling. I want to do something to help heal the earth. And I don't know what that's going to be, but that's the direction I need to go. And so when I went to undergrad, I studied biology, environmental studies, and connected with birds. And then I connected with big cats. And it was the big cats that led me out to the Northwest. And then, you heard the whale piece from that point forward. What sustains me is, I need to get out in nature periodically, because so often when you're, what the public sees often of Greenpeace is the tip of the spear. Those flashes in the pan of the exotic actions. And, it's not till you get involved where you realize that 99.9% of the work is not at that moment. It's what goes into everything that makes that possible, and what you need to do with whatever awareness you're able to raise through those few peak opportunities. So you can get ground down working in an office. So you need to get out and be in nature to be reminded, to have your soul refilled with what it means to connect directly with nature. The other piece for me is that, for me, my connections to people in Greenpeace were the deepest right in the very beginning. When we started Greenpeace Seattle, and that first, the year afterwards, when we did a couple of actions at Trident, we formed an affinity group. There were many affinity groups, but we called ourselves, not surprisingly, the Pod. And, we were a family. There was no, I didn't apply for a job with Greenpeace for the first 7 years I was with the organization. I just did what I did, and it's like, oh, well, here's the next job for you. And that little group in Seattle, it was, we are a family. It was an incestuous family. You go out and it's like, who hasn't slept with anybody else?
Yeah.
And that, that has the good and the bad, but that's what it was. And then near the end of my first stint with Greenpeace, it began, I realized, it had shifted. That I was no longer a part of the family, I was a tool. And I felt used like a tool, and it didn't feel good. I felt like I'd given my heart and soul. My identity was Greenpeace. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to not be part of Greenpeace. And that was kind of ripped away from me. And, so I spent 3 years at the Humane Society of the US, and then Ann Dingwall invited me to come back. And God bless her, she gave me a second stint. And, I welcome that second opportunity. But again, my frame of mind had shifted. It was kind of like, I believe in this work, but I'm doing a job. And I believed in the job, but it was different than in the beginning. And, you can be nostalgic about those feelings of being part of a family versus I'm here doing a job, and I can be fired, I can be hired, I can go somewhere else to do some other job. So, in a way, I think you have to learn to look out for yourself a little bit, because while you have close relationships, ultimately, you are working for an organization, and there's no escaping that. So I guess to answer the other part of your question, I was very cynical about people. And I think it's easy to become cynical about, can people really save the planet, because we're ultimately just so helpless ourselves. We're such a selfish species. And I think that's where the AVP work has been really important to me, is to realize that, yes, we're all suffering. We are all traumatized by what we are doing to each other, what we're doing to the planet. But deep inside, and this is my Quaker piece, there is that of God in every person. In some people, it seems to be hidden a little more deeply than others, but it's there. And it's our responsibility to try to connect with that goodness, that spirit in each other, because literally that is the only way that we're going to survive, that we're going to turn things around. We're not going to win it. And this is sort of where, for me, when I did the Iceland boycott, I was called an economic terrorist. And that, it stung. But in a way, it was true. When you're going out in front of a whaling ship, you are righteous. You're feeling, I'm putting my life on the line for this. I'm doing this and I'm willing to go to prison. I was looking at a 20-year prison term in Peru when we did our action there. But I believed in it. But when we started getting very technical, very strategic, what are we doing to push those levers to get this person to do that thing and get that company to do that thing? It's, you begin to justify your strategies because it's effective. But if you lose sight of the ethical path, then I think we're in trouble.
So interesting. When you were speaking before about the James Bay, describing Rex Weiler as your mentor, right? Some of the things you just said then remind me so much of things that I've heard him say about healing your own wounds and being aware, that self-awareness. And it sounds like you've had several watershed moments throughout your time of differing changes in your awareness to bring you to where you are now. It was also reminded with something Bunny spoke about during her call about being in the movement and not seeing it as, she was interesting, not seeing it as a family or a job, but always focusing in on the values and the mission and the ethics and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and making sure those reasons are something that you're comfortable with and are virtuous, as you said. It's very interesting. Thank you very much for being so open, I think, as well. Really appreciate you taking the time and being open about these things as well. Yeah. I'm going to give people one last chance to ask a question. I see a comment. Thank you very much for the wonderful stories and for sharing your stories as well. I have one. I think you may have just answered that question, to be honest with you. But the question I usually ask at the end is, what advice would you give to the next generation of activists? And I honestly think some of the things that you just said are very, very good advice. But do you have any additional advice to finish the session off with?
I guess the only thing that's maybe just saying the same thing in a different way is be true to yourself. Some of my Greenpeace creds come from having done those investigations that I did for the whales. I did undercover work for EIA documenting tiger bone trade, illegal logging in Honduras. As time went on, it got harder and harder for me to do that, because when you do undercover work, if you're going to succeed, you are lying to people every minute of every day for as long as you're doing it. And it takes, if you're not a sociopath, it takes a toll on your soul to do that. And I did it for many years, feeling the ends justifies the means, that if this truth doesn't come out, these whales are going to keep being killed. But I finally, after that last time in Honduras, where I was, and you're not just lying to the people who are the quote the bad guys. You're to maintain cover. You are lying to everyone. You have your story and you stick with it until you leave the country. And I just got to a point where I can't do this anymore. It's important work. It needs to be done, but it can't be me anymore. And I think everyone needs to ask themselves whatever the same relevant question is for yourself. You know, am I doing so that what I'm doing that's aligned with the organization, that's aligned with the environmental work, is aligned with my conscience. Don't allow yourself to be a tool, because you'll hurt your soul if you keep doing something that you know is going against your grain, no matter how important it seems to be.
It's a wonderful answer, and I think I see some hearts, mate. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And checking in and having that awareness as well,
Okay.
I think is really, is really valuable and really important. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I wasn't prepared. We dealt with some heavy topics. I wasn't expecting us to go as deep as we did, but thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and coming in and sharing all of this with us. I think there's a lot to digest during this call.
I can't really. There isn't time. No, I can't. I asked him to.
There we go. We'll just ignore that one. This is the part of the call, though, where I ask everybody to unmute themselves and say thank you. It means a lot.
Well, I have to do a shout out to Bill Darnell. Bill, you go farther back than me, so great to see you at a later stage of life with that classic T-shirt.
Hey, Campbell, thank you so much. That was so inspiring and so interesting and so much food for thought. It's Barbara Stowe here. And hi, Uncle Bill.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
A pleasure to meet you, Barbara. Yeah, you were part of the original Quakers.
Yeah, but you know, I was a teenager when I hear your stories, like I was nothing. I was a drop in the bucket. And at times I was a whiny drop in the bucket. And at other times I was an impassioned drop in the bucket. But yeah, what you've been through and told us is just amazing. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate, Simon, thank you for putting this together. You know, it's interesting. I have a 50th reunion from my high school happening in a while. This means a lot more, to be honest.
Well, thank you for saying so. It's an absolute, I mean, it's a privilege to set these up and to be part of this. For everybody else on the call, don't think you're getting off. Please unmute yourself. Please turn your cameras on and thank our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
If you all would like to learn more about my Amazon work, can I put in a quick plug, Simon?
Absolutely, you can. Please.
Okay, I'll just put in the chat here. It's amazonecology.org, and we're having the other one where we have more stories is amazonalive.net.
There we go. Things for people to check out. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully see some of you, or all of you, at the next call.
And keep up the good work, guys. It's great to see you. I wish I could have heard your stories too.
Right. We will stay in touch.
All of this.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon.
Bye, guys.